afternoon from Rio, good evening in Germany. This is the last session of the public lecture series, of the last public session of the lecture series, Making Sense of the Post-COVID World, Continuities and Changes. And so for this last session, we are very happy to have with us Professor Elisio Macamo from Basel University, and he will be speaking today on the pandemic as disaster, African perspectives. Elisio, welcome. We're truly honored to have you here with us, and to introduce you, Professor Sergio Costa will do the honors.
Thank you, Mariana. Welcome, Elisio, also from my side. Just a brief introduction for those who don't know you. So Elisio Macamo concluded his doctoral and also his habilitation, the sort of postdoctoral dissertation at the University of Bayreuth in Germany, and is a professor of sociology and African studies at the University of Basel. So his main research areas are sociology of science and risk, sociology of religion, and perhaps what we can put together as a sort of critical development studies. He has extensively published in these areas in different languages, in particular in Portuguese, English, and German. So also in Mozambique, also at the level of the international discussions on Africa, Elisio Macamo is a very important voice, and of course also in the German-speaking countries. Among his many publications, I like to highlight two especially influential books. The first one first published in German with the title What is Africa, or Was ist Afrika? Zur Geschichte und Kultursoziologie eines modernen Konstrukts. That is, What is Africa, on history and cultural sociology of a modern construct, and the taming of it, approaching risk from a social action perspective, case studies from southern Mozambique. So Elisio, thank you very much again. We are looking very much to listen to you and also to have the chance to discuss with you afterwards. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariana, Sergio, and Mauricio. I'm very delighted to be here with you. And like I've just heard from Mauricio, this is going to be the last presentation in this lecture series, which is always a very difficult thing for me. I always have this problem of having the last word. In my partnerships, I never have the last word. Whatever I say after my partner has spoken is the start of a new discussion, but we'll be fine. Now, at the height of the corona crisis last year, Stern, the German magazine, it ran the headline, Mysterious Africa. Why are there so few corona dead in Africa? Now, Stern was not the only magazine or newspaper to be so baffled. It became almost a cottage industry to offer explanations for why Africans appeared to defy supposedly ironclad corona rules, requiring millions of Africans to die at the mere sight of the pandemic. And as an African, I was, of course, relieved when I first read that Africans seem to be defying these rules. I even entertained the idea that perhaps we Africans are made from a different kind of fabric, which renders us more resilient in spite of all the well-grounded scientific reasons why we Africans should be dropping dead like flies. But because there was no end to the questions, and given the devastating situation in Europe and America, it struck me that the most appropriate response should actually be to apologize on behalf of Africans for our failure to meet the expectations of everybody else in the world to die. Now the question, and I think this is the key question, is, if we pose to think about the German magazine's terminology, what we mean when we use the word mystery to address Corona in Africa, and by extension in the world, particularly in Europe, of course. At first glance, it seems as if one is disappointed that the usual horror scenarios are not confirmed this time. The world is no longer used to witnessing a pandemic that rages across stable economies like European economies, solid health infrastructure like in Europe, and functional administrative structures like in Europe, and while at it, killing many people, bringing entire societies to their knees, and causing governments to consider fundamental liberties disposable in what they take to be the public's interest, while at the same time seeming to spare Africa. Now, when the world faces dire straits, the logical thing to do is to fear the worst for Africa. Such is the strength of this expectation that when it fails to materialize, we all seem to be lost. Personally, I've always looked at this pandemic as above all a moment of learning. Now, the trouble is that we may have failed to take advantage of it. For understandable reasons, European countries, almost without exceptions, they responded to the pandemic in almost the same way that soccer professionals and fans deploy statistics to make sense of the game. They seek, if you like, solace, refuge in the encouraging messages that they can elicit from chance and what to me seems like randomness. For example, how often a home team has won against an away team when playing on a rainy afternoon after having been down by 2 goals at halftime. It is high level and, if you like, sophisticated superstition, which masquerades as science that has been elevated to a high art form in German soccer commentary, which is what I follow most. Now, several months later, after havoc was wreaked on economies and societies in understandable reaction, if you like, to the pandemic, we may be forced to admit that knowing too much may not have served Europe well. Unfortunately, however, knowing too little, but following the lead and the advice of those who thought to be in possession of enough knowledge to act may not have helped Africa either. Let me see. I think I lost my thoughts here. But I was saying that knowing a little, but following those who think that they know may not be a good thing. I think there's something here which we can describe as the paradox of knowledge. Knowing too much may not, after all, be a good thing. And to follow those who don't know enough, don't trust their ignorance for understandable reasons, and therefore they follow the lead of those who know dangerously too much. Now, to talk about continuities and changes, which is what you are addressing in this lecture series, seems to me to be addressing the problem of knowing what to do or not to do with the knowledge we have or with the knowledge that we do not have. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic invites us to revisit, in my view, some debates in sociology that may be useful in helping us understand not only what is going on, but also what this all means to Africa and the world. I would like to revisit one such debate, more specifically in the sociology of risk. It raises theoretical and conceptual issues which are central to the job we are supposed to do as social scientists. That is the job of rendering the world intelligible, while at the same time challenging ourselves never to take things for granted. Now, the debate played an important role in my own work in the field. From 2001 to 2008, I worked on disasters in Mozambique together with colleagues at the University of Bayreuth in Germany, more specifically with Dieter Neubert, who was at the time my boss. We were interested in learning how individuals and communities coped with extreme situations. And our point of departure was the world famous event, the floods that took place in the year 2000 in southern Mozambique. We wanted to learn something about local coping mechanisms, but the broader theoretical and conceptual goal went beyond this. We were interested in finding out whether the concept of disaster used in disaster sociology was appropriate in accounting for how these people in southern Mozambique coped with the floods. In other words, we were interested in engaging with the assumptions underlying the use of the concept of disaster in our field, that is in the field of sociology of disaster, and then explore the ways in which insights that we could gain in Mozambique could be deployed to improve the study of disaster elsewhere in Europe, in America, or in Asia. Now, our first shock came with my first trip to the field. Since I did not want to influence our research intentions or shape our research intentions by asking suggestive questions, I set out to start my inquiry by first finding out what local individuals and communities perceived as a disaster. So I thought the best thing to do was to simply ask my interview partners if anything uncommon or extraordinary had happened in recent times. So this was in 2001, 1 year after the floods. Now the flood had happened in 2000. So I thought that it would immediately come to their mind, from which point onwards, I would then ask questions closer to the analytical repertoire of disaster sociology. Now people thought hard about the question, and at first, all of them said, no, nothing uncommon happened here. And I insisted by asking for things which do not usually happen, things which disrupt normal everyday life. That is, all the indicators disaster sociology uses to describe a disaster. And the answer, which all of them gave me after my insistence, was the story of a whale which was stranded at the beach and which had fed the villages for 2 weeks. It had happened before the floods. And this was then the first shock that I had in my research. The second shock was realizing that an occurrence or an event as such is not enough for people to describe it as a disaster. In other words, a disaster is almost always defined as such retrospectively. Now, the reason why people did not mention the 2000 floods when I asked them about the extraordinary event in their lives was because the floods had occurred too soon for people to know what they meant. Local custom holds floods to be perfectly normal events, which, if things work out well according to habit and tradition, will actually bring a good harvest. In fact, I met several people who were rescued several times because at night they would swim back to their places of origins to get their animals or other belongings, and then to wave to the German and South African helicopters, which were hovering down early in the morning to rescue more people. Now, the floods became a disaster when the harvest failed because the soil was hard and the peasants could not farm it. Now, these two shocks are important for any reflection on disasters, and in particular on COVID. There is more to knowledge than simply what we can account for by drawing from reason and facts. Knowledge, and I'm not the first one to say this, is always situated and comes into fruition against the background of social action. While it is important to know, that is, to have a clear idea of what is the case, it is probably more important to know when what we think we know is relevant to tackling problems. Now, the sociology of risk and disaster tells us that there is a difference between reacting to and responding to a hazard, that is, to an impending danger. A reaction boils down to doing something no matter what, simply because the situation requires that one does something. It is almost instinctual. Responding to a hazard, however, is much more than this. It means assessing the potential impact of the hazard, given the available coping mechanisms, and then taking decisions which in all likelihood address potential damages, but in full awareness of everything that might go wrong. So this is, if you like, the difference between danger and risk. As one famous German sociologist, Niklas Luhmann, once put it, a danger is an external event with potentially damaging consequences that we are not aware of, whereas a risk entails the conscious decision to do something as a consequence of a critical and conscious engagement with that external event. Now, this distinction has dogged sociology, the sociology of risk, for many decades. This research area used to assume that danger and risk correlated with underdeveloped and developed countries. And it placed emphasis on two things. One was knowledge, namely the idea that where science is not strong, people are not aware of what poses a danger to their livelihood. And for this reason, they become, if you like, passive victims of circumstances. So this would be the case with Africa. And the other was technology, that is the technical capacity to respond to what one knows. And this is a description, if you like, of modern society. Now, research has shown how problematic this distinction is. In my own research on coping with extreme events, natural and man-made, for instance, I have come to the view that taking risks is an anthropological constant. So it's not European, it's not African, it's not American, it's not Asian. In other words, taking risks describes the nature of human action. Now, individuals act in order to be able to act. I can put this differently. Everything that we do in life is contingent on several things. some of which we do not control. For this reason, what we do is always risky. I can decide, for example, to pursue an academic career. I will choose the subject where I think I am strong, I'm strong enough, and I will integrate myself in the right kinds of networks. But none of this will guarantee me any success because I do not control all the intervening factors. I still take the bet because I hope that by doing certain things, I will be closer to my goal or to reaching my objectives. Now, the logic, I think, is the same, whether we are talking about individuals, communities, or countries. Everyone is always in the process of translating dangers into risks. For acting in order to be able to act transforms dangers or hazards into calculated risks. Now, some are overwhelmed by the hazards because of their magnitude. And I think a pandemic like COVID-19 is a danger which poses an almost insurmountable challenge to every coping mechanism in Africa. And Africa has been in a permanent state of crisis due largely to its position in the global concert of nations. Now, this does not mean that African countries can only react and not act. I think they can respond, as indeed they have throughout, owing to how colonial history doctored the dice against the continent. Now, this means that the continent's default position consists in always translating hazards into risks. Now, what makes it difficult for Africa to do this is the extent to which, if you like, structural conditions do not always allow the continent to undertake this translation process on its own terms. What we describe, for example, as development is actually a struggle undertaken by African countries to enable themselves to define risk in their own terms within frameworks which are largely beyond the continent's, Africa's control. In this sense, COVID-19 does not pose any particularly different kind of hazard to Africa. Just like with everything African countries have to do to secure their own existence as nations, responding to this pandemic has followed the familiar pattern of having to decide whether to pretend to be a normal society and therefore do the same kinds of things which other societies are doing, or to go down a different road at the risk of conveying the impression of lacking commitment to public health. Now, COVID-19 as a hazard was translated into a risk in most developed societies, especially in Europe and America, through a very simple mechanism. It consisted in perceiving the hazard as a threat to the health infrastructure, and this threat required slow rates of infection, the so-called flattening of the curve, in order to protect the infrastructure and make sure that this infrastructure will respond adequately when it is called to respond. Now, when several African countries rushed to declare lockdown measures of different sorts, they basically adopted the translation of the risk of the developed countries. They failed to draw from their own experience in coping with crisis by, for example, empowering their people to fend for themselves. The nature of the pandemic in Africa did not place before African nations a choice between saving lives or protecting the economic fabric of the country. Rather, and as cruel as it may sound to all of us, the pandemic placed the choice between allowing many Africans to die without protecting the economic fabric, so that's one possibility, or allowing many Africans to die while protecting the economic fabric. Now, by rushing to adopt lockdown measures, those African countries which went down this road effectively withdrew protection from the only infrastructure that has served Africa reasonably well for many years, namely the social infrastructure. So a local translation of risk would have entailed identifying measures which reduce the likelihood of infection while fending for oneself. In Africa, going out to the street to secure one's livelihood at the risk of infection is what individuals need to do in order to have a life which is worth protecting. Locking people down at home renders them even more vulnerable, since it not only renders them dependent on others for their survival, but also, and those others, basically the state, which is non-existent, but also because it takes away from them the only thing that gives their life meaning, namely the risks that they have to take to secure their own lives. I think it's still early to say whether the announced doom that failed to materialize, at least so far, Africa has not experienced any of the horror scenarios which concerned people and institutions around the world have been drawing. I think this has given the lie, if you like, to the hurried measures, to the rushed measures which were adopted by African governments to fight the pandemic. It is clear, however, that such measures were a serious departure from local cultures of risk, such that if push comes to shove, it will not be COVID-19 killing people in Africa, but rather the measures which were taken to prevent the virus from killing people. So it is, as the saying goes in German, committing suicide for fear of dying. This is what African countries actually did. Now, Europe responded by developing measures which had the goal of flattening the curve, as I have already said. And the idea was to slow down the rate of infections in order to protect health infrastructure from collapse, and in that way to secure the ability of the health infrastructure to respond to the cases as they came. Now, this was the basic reasoning, and it informed all other measures. Now, while flattening the curve may have been the best principle to adopt under the circumstances, it has never been clear whether all the measures adopted to apply it in practice were warranted. These include, for example, very strict lockdown policies, compulsory testing for access to some services, and later even the social shaming of those who refuse to vaccinate on whatever grounds they brought forward. Now, when knowledge is uncertain, it is usually never a good idea to respond in radical ways. Piecemeal approaches, to use a term used by Karl Popper, such as those initially pursued, for example, by Sweden, may be the better course of action, since they allow for corrective measures to be taken. And this is, if you like, standard knowledge in risk studies. So African countries basically followed European policy thinking. In my own country, in Mozambique, which is in Southern Africa, the government was very quick to react, essentially locking down. And in so doing, as I've already suggested, It threw thousands of people into unemployment, as, for example, tourism collapsed, which is a major employer in Mozambique, and many businesses were unable to operate properly. So locking down also meant sending millions of people into despair, as informal economic activities were banned. The informal sector in Mozambique is perhaps the most important lifeline for the poor, who happen to be the majority in any developing country, not just in Mozambique. In fact, following the European line of seeking to flatten the curve revealed the floppy, shoddy thinking of governments in Africa. Europeans locked down in order to protect health facilities. With no health facilities to protect, there was no reason, no strong reason why African countries should have gone that way. Locking down in Africa amounted, under our circumstances, to committing suicide for fear of death, as I have already suggested. It is interesting that while countries faced with the same pandemic, the science available to deal with the problem could not have been a single story. There are quite a few reasons why this could and should not have been true. I think the first reason is that science does not simply tell us what is the case. It gives us information which we can draw from taking into account our circumstances. Now, if you flatten the curve in Europe, you may, that may have made sense given the fact that people in Europe did indeed have lives to protect. But the same logic could not work in Africa, because for Africans to have lives worth protecting, they had to put them at risk by allowing people to go out into the streets, by allowing people to board, for example, overcrowded buses, by allowing people to brush shoulders with strangers wearing no masks, by allowing people to do all the kinds of things you're not supposed to do in a pandemic. Now, while the level of testing is too low to allow us to have a proper sense of what happened in Africa, the mere fact that we are not having, and we've not had so far any dramatic scenes of death and despair in Africa supports the impression that the pandemic may not have been as severe as we feared that it would be. In fact, I was surprised recently to read reports about an evaluation that was carried out in Germany concerning the measures which were adopted. And most of the conclusions drawn from that evaluation seem to confirm some of the things that I am seeing here, not only about Africa, but about why it is too risky to act decisively on uncertain knowledge. Now, the second reason is that science is at its best when it helps us identify the right questions, not when it supplies us with solutions. Part of the reason why the debate over how best to address the pandemic became very difficult in Europe is not just that it was polarized. It is also because of the focus on debating solutions, so flattening the curve, instead of concentrating on how best to define the problem for which there seem to be so many solutions. Was the problem really protecting health infrastructure to be able to save lives, or rather identifying those at risk and protecting them in a targeted way, like Sweden did, for example? Now, it will take years of research to settle this issue. But what is clear at this stage is the difference that it makes to approach risk in a social environment that, for understandable reasons, does not tolerate the the loss of lives. And that is the case of Europe, America, and perhaps even Asia. In Africa, I think things unfortunately are different. Even if African governments failed to follow the risk thinking of their own societies, African approaches to risk might have come in handy, perhaps even in Europe, partly because of the experience of disaster, partly also because of the lack of means of protection. Africans have learned to approach disasters with a frame of mind which is more tolerant, for example, of casualties as an inevitable consequence of disaster. This sounds harsh, I know. Unlike in Europe, where the number of the dead counts, in Africa, it is the number of survivors that counts, not of the dead. This does not imply that losing lives does not matter. It means simply accepting, perhaps fatalistically, perhaps not, that nature may be bigger than we think we are. A disaster under these circumstances is only one if after a natural event or if after a pandemic has occurred, life cannot resume its normal course. And in a curious sort of way, the pandemic, I think, exposed European vulnerabilities. For example, the European heavy reliance on medical infrastructure and the legitimate expectations of the elderly, for everyone, that this infrastructure will meet their needs. I think democracy added to this by dangling the threat of a high political price to pay if governments fail to convey the impression of doing something. Now, Africans have always responded to crisis by appealing to their deep social safety networks for protection and perhaps even for action. This may sound romantic, like a romantic view of the continent that I'm distilling here, but I think there is reason to believe that it is a pragmatic recognition of the continent's current situation, a recognition that, Africans have responded in resilient ways, albeit at a high human cost. I think lockdowns, at least in theory, they weaken these safety nets by depriving people of both their livelihoods and their opportunities to bond, which is a very important thing in a risk situation. Where ignorance could have been bliss as far as Africa is concerned, it became powerlessness as the continent followed Europe in what was arguably an ill-advised commitment to responding scientifically to uncertain knowledge. As one after the other, European countries begin to lift the emergency measures, it is striking to realize that governments and scientists do not necessarily know more today than they did a year ago or earlier when they first resorted to such measures. It is almost as if they could declare the pandemic over and done with by simply pretending it is not as dangerous as they thought it was, or rather, that even if it is that dangerous as they thought it was, it would not be wise to hold whole societies hostage to legitimate fears of disaster. It felt very strange for me in Switzerland, for example, to go to bed knowing that, when you wake up, that formidable, invisible enemy you were being protected against will no longer require the same levels of concern that, just the day before was requiring. So I guess in conclusion, what I wanted to share with you is perhaps a much more general, if you like, theoretical point. And that is that if we are talking about continuities and change, what the pandemic and the way that societies responded to the pandemic tells us is that knowledge, too much knowledge, can be a dangerous thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very inspiring presentation. Do any of my colleagues want to begin the questions, or should I? Okay, go ahead, Sajid.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really inspiring, more than inspiring, also somehow intriguing also approach to the disasters, but specifically also to approaching the pandemic. So I got different questions which are not necessarily related, but perhaps you can start. Yeah, I can ask you at least three questions. Became quite interesting in discussing with you. The first one is your emphasis on the local cultures of risks, which we also know from your previous work. But my question to this is, if in the case of the pandemic, could you really talk about local cultures of risk without taking into account the production of a sort of entangled global medical knowledge? So you don't have isolated local cultures of risks. You have this local culture of risk also integrated in a sort of course, uneven, unequal, asymmetrical, let's say, knowledge system in which medical knowledge, but also local knowledge are included. So therefore, my question, this first question would be how to differentiate this sort of entangled knowledge, which has been accumulated during the pandemic, from these different local cultures of risk. This will be one question. The second one is, perhaps a sort of also provocation for your provocations in your insistence to also again see this sort of violation of this, a sort of epistemic violation of the local cultures of risk in the conduction of policies against the virus, in which African countries, we can also apply this to South American countries, just take measures adopted in other countries without taking into account the local knowledge and also local forms of dealing with risks. So I see this very much, but my question is another, is the violence of the virus itself. So it's not this what destroys the ways people had to deal with risks. So the instruments they had, the tools they had to deal with risks were not somehow efficient for dealing with the pandemic. Therefore, what the most important violence is not the epistemic violence, is perhaps the virus. And very third question is related to the policies adopted, because we insisted very much in the policy adopted in different countries of flattening the curve. But you had also policies, mass vaccination, you had also expansion of health infrastructures, also testing. So are all these measures something that you see working against, again, these local ways of dealing with risks? Or are these measures you can also adopt?
Mariana, I know there are a lot of questions already, but my questions relate very directly to Sergio's questions, so I think it would be better to connect them. No, the first one relates very directly to what Sergio asked you. but also to what you said during your talk, because you started with the definition of risk, which was context bound, right? People don't see risk in the same way as people see risk in other places. That was one thing, right? Because you went to do field work, and when you got there, you were astonished that people had seen things that were entirely different from the ones you expect. Actually, people had seen nothing related to what you expected to find there. So this is one thing. But then you ended up saying, well, but governments are pragmatic because they say they can do so much. So it seems to be some tension in argument in this regard. So one is a sort of, perhaps even a sort of local daily life epistemology, which is not commensurable to what we are used to have in terms of Western scientific knowledge. And the second one is just to realize that you can't do so much. People are going to die, and you take care of the survivors. If you lock down, it's even worse because people have no livelihoods. They want to be together. So if you can comment on that, that would be great. The second issue is more simple, is that the fact, because some countries in Africa did have a very strong lockdown. For instance, South Africa, they were very strict at some point. So you spoke of Africa, I can understand that. You speak about Latin America, but maybe, but this relates also directly to the first point I made, because in South Africa, they took a very World Health Organization approach. So they come very much on the side of Western, or I prefer to say modern scientific knowledge.
These are great but difficult questions. I hope
you wouldn't get away with that after such a provocation.
Okay. Now let me see if I can address them in a useful way. This thing about local cultures of risk within a global context, I think it's got two sides to it. So there's a political side, and that political side constrains African governments and African countries to do things which are legible to international institutions and to other governments. Because, you still want to have your citizens travel abroad. You still want certain things to happen at the world stage. So you can only do that if you indicate clearly to other countries that you are taking precautions that are recognized by other countries. So if you do not have any policy to address the pandemic, you're going to be in trouble because your citizens will not be able to travel and so on. So there's that political side. But my point was actually a different one. The point was that one thing is the set of measures which certain countries adopt in order to address the pandemic, and the other thing, because of their own circumstances, and the other thing is whether the measures which you adopt, which are being adopted by others, will work under your own circumstances. And it is clear to me, there's no study, unfortunately, yet in many African countries that adopt lockdown measures, but it's clear to me that they made no difference at all to the development, to the evolution of the pandemic, right? In fact, if they did make a difference, was actually undermining the economic infrastructure. And I think that more people will be killed by the economic consequences of the measures taken than by the pandemic itself. Now, of course, this is a controversial issue, right? Because there's always the issue of knowing whether we really know the exact picture in Africa. Do we know how many people have got COVID? Can we trust the statistics and so on. But we have easy controversial proxies, right? If you have a serious pandemic in Africa, you see people dying, right? You see people falling off right, streets and all of that. You had that with Ebola, the first Ebola, you had that. But if you compare the scenes that you had in Africa and the scenes that you had in Europe, in Italy, Spain, Portugal, right, or Britain, or the US or Brazil, no comparison. So what this raises as an issue, and this is controversial, I acknowledge that. What this raises as an issue is really how much we know about, if you like, the biology, the biomedical elements of the whole thing. So there was a huge discussion in Africa whether, there is some kind of protection that Africans have, which other people elsewhere do not have. So there were several hypotheses that were circulated. One hypothesis was, the fact that people have all been vaccinated against tuberculosis, right? And so that probably contributed towards making them more resilient. And in fact, the only country in Africa that really had a serious problem, Mauricio, was South Africa. And the interesting thing about South Africa is that economically and socially, it looks very much like Europe. And the areas where the problem was more acute in South Africa was the Cape Province, and you have more than 200,000, 300,000 old retired Europeans living there, right? So there's something interesting there, which we don't know, and I think we should know in order to make, to take safer conclusions. Now, to come back to Sergio's question, this epistemic violation, as opposed to the violence of the virus. Now, I'm forgetting the name of the British anthropologist now. I don't know why I'm forgetting the name. It's quite famous. He's done a lot of work in West Africa, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, and he wrote two or 3 years ago a very interesting book called Ebola. It was a study of the second Ebola, in Africa. And again, people were expecting a lot of people to die. And this time, not many people died. And his hypothesis is, what he drew as a conclusion was that not many people died because people did not go to hospitals. They stayed at home, right? Because hospitals, if they had gone to hospitals, with the conditions in which you find hospitals in Africa, there would have been a massive spread of infections there. So what actually saved Africans from Ebola was not going to medical infrastructure. That's quite interesting. And that's the point I'm trying to make in some way, that, you need to respond to local ways of dealing with situations like this. It's not the case that something that is a solution elsewhere will necessarily be a solution only because it's got science supporting it. I think there is a social context for science to work, and you can be right scientifically and wrong socially. Right, and that example of Ebola shows that quite clearly. So that's also a response to Mauricio's first question. It's not really that I am claiming that there is a different notion of risk in Africa. Actually, the point is more nuanced than that. What I am saying is that risk is the same if you approach it sociologically as, you know, the way in which people seek to enable themselves to act. You know, this is the key thing in any situation. You want to be able to act, right? And so responding to risk is actually always based on creating conditions for you to be able to act. Yeah, however you interpret the risk, you know, so that is the basic thing that we all have in common, right? Now, that will differ depending on the context. You know, that is what differs. So it's not that, you know, people are sillier, they're less reasonable, they're not scientific and so on. No, the issue is that, you know, people want to enable themselves to act, you know, and science is not the only thing that enables you to act. Under African circumstances, that's something which we need to take seriously. And the pandemic has shown actually that many African countries would have been wiser not adopting the extreme measures that were adopted in Europe, because you know, they were not legible to Africans themselves. They were only legible to international institutions, and that's a problem. You know, you have a problem if you act in that way. But of course, there are exceptions. So South Africa is a big exception, but for the reasons that I mentioned earlier on, and that's the country that suffered most. Actually, if even, you know, we are having, you know, more and more information about COVID statistics in Africa, and no country in Africa reached the death toll that South Africa had. So there's, you know, you just have a completely different situation there in South Africa. Now, I do think that the policies, you know, whatever they are worth, Sergio. So, you know, I think vaccination, I mean, of course, here in Europe, the idea was that we flatten the curve while we wait for the vaccination, while we wait for the development of the vaccine. And then when we have it, we can, you know, introduce it, right? Now, that was a risky thing to bet for in Africa, right? You know, to say, okay, we flatten and we wait for the vaccine, which you are not going to afford, right? And so, you know, in many countries, it took very long for most people to be vaccinated. In fact, even today, a lot of people have not been vaccinated. And the reason why they have not been vaccinated is not because they are against the vaccine. It's just their governments cannot afford it. So there again, I think a policy that makes sense in Europe doesn't make sense in Africa. You know, so that is not what people should have had their bet on, right? I think what would have made more sense, but here I'm just speculating, what would have made more sense would have been really, I'll sound cruel here, accept that some people will die, or a lot of people will die, and then protect those that you can protect, you know, because even in Europe, you know, a lot of people died in spite of everything that was done. Yeah, and more people actually than in Africa, which is interesting. Yeah, so perhaps I can end there also by saying also that what I struggle with as far as Corona is concerned is how little we know, but we always assume that we know a lot about it. We don't. I don't think we do. You know, we are under the illusion of knowledge, I think. And that is one reason why, again, African countries should have done differently, and perhaps also why some European countries might have done better following African ways of dealing with risks. I think one, you had a closer example of that. I think Sweden. Sweden had an African response to Corona, I would say. And it didn't do much, much worse than any other country in Europe. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much for really thinking about all this. So it's actually very hard to respond in time because I'm really fascinated by everything you just said, and I really hear you. So I was going to ask you something about vaccines. I was going to ask you stuff about would it be possible for Africa to do its own lockdown given the interconnectedness of the economic life these days, right? Because one of the examples that you gave us was tourism, for instance, right? So
Yeah.
How would Africa manage to not do a lockdown on its own, given all these economic connectivities? I was going to ask you all this,
Yeah.
but after your question, I just don't think, after hearing your answers, I just don't think those questions are that important. So I want to go back to where you are right now. And I want to ask you about, when you started and you were talking about, right, this a different perception of disaster in Africa vis-a-vis Europe, for instance, right? And I think this resonates a lot with this paper that came out right in the beginning of the pandemic on collective life in cities of the global south, right? We're talking about exactly that. It's impossible to think about lockdowns in our cities. It's not how things work. And you said something also about the social infrastructures, that would be what's different about Africa. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's sort of at the heart of what some good responses here in Brazil and in other places of the world. So and thinking about this idea of collective life and thinking about, Abdulmalik Simon's idea of people as infrastructure, I'd like to hear you talk a bit more about these social infrastructures, how they operate, how they're different in different countries, because that's the other thing, right? We're talking about Africa, and you just talked about the massive differences between what happened in South Africa and what happened in Mozambique, and I bet that's very different from what happened in Northern Africa and Western Africa. So could you talk a little bit about these infrastructures and how particular cases, what works, like what's driving this, right? Your thought here on these issues.
Okay, good. Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah, it is. It's your fault. I had very easy questions before that.
Okay, I'll try. No, I think I'm glad that you are raising the question, because I think this is a key aspect of my thinking around these issues. So this idea of a social infrastructure, and the way I look at it is very much connected with with the notion of value, right? So when is a life valuable? Because if you want to protect something, it's got to be valuable, right? So perhaps the way to think about a social infrastructure is to define it as that which is there to protect, to define and protect value, what is valuable, right? Now, the thing with the response to the pandemic, with the official response to the pandemic, is that it did not, that response did not define, let me rephrase this. The problem with the response, the official response to the pandemic, was that it deprived people of the value which they should be interested in protecting. Now, how did they do that? By preventing people from going out to the street to risk their lives, to secure their livelihood. If you stay at home, right, because you're not allowed to go to the street, you're not allowed to go to school, you're not allowed to go to work, and so on, you have no life to protect, right? You have no life to protect. You only have a life to protect if it is at risk out there. Yeah. So this is where the idea of a social infrastructure comes into place, because, and I'm coming back to my definition of risk, because risk is enabling yourself to act. So if people go out to the street, they will also create conditions that will enable them to protect themselves while they're working. And these are vernacular forms that people will create, right? So the commitment to, for example, to keep a distance, for example, to support other people and so on, will be stronger if you know that you have a life which is worth protecting. And this is not African. I mean, one of the problems, for example, that they report here in Germany, this was published, I think, on Monday, that evaluated the corona response in Germany, right? One of the problems was that because people with all these measures felt safe, they no longer committed themselves to those measures, right? So they were using the same masks for a week or 2 weeks. When we were told you should just, use it for a few hours. They were not putting it properly. They were not washing their hands, and they were not doing this on purpose. They felt safe, right? So Marianne, I cannot say more than that. I'm trying to escape your question by philosophizing about it. And really the philosophy is on two levels. First of all, you need to have something worth protecting. So infrastructure, a social infrastructure means that you have to create value. You have to make a life valuable, right? And you won't make a life valuable by preventing people from risking it, right? You make people vulnerable, right? And this is what happened in Mozambique, in Malawi, in the countries that I observed. This is what happened. They made people vulnerable. Yeah. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that the social infrastructure actually creates its own ways of enabling people to do things, right? And I think any government intervention, especially in circumstances like those which obtain in Africa, and I would suggest even in a country like Brazil, right, where it's much more difficult to have an institutional intervention into society, I think it makes much more sense to invest in promoting this social infrastructure, in the hope that people will have their own responses to these things. And you just support those responses, right? But you don't take away from the people the incentive to actually protect themselves. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm the one who laid the hard question on you. I have a couple more questions here from my student Louisa, she really enjoyed your lecture, and so I'm going to read out her questions to you. Okay, so the first one is inspiring lecture, mainly because you talk about the importance of community over individual safety. Even though you differentiated countries, do you feel there's also a difference in politics? I mean, for example, is there a difference in what you're talking about between neoliberal politics and radical left politics? So that's her first question. And her second question is, she says, nowadays we talk a lot about necropolitics. How would you see this concept and the idea of what? How death, okay, and life for to mobilize politics. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Very hard questions from down here.
Yeah, very tough. Yeah. Oof. Okay. I mean, I was not warned that it was going to be like this. But okay, no, I think the first question concerning whether there's a difference between neoliberal and radical left politics, I would say, and I'm not the first one to say this, but I'm not so sure that, you know, this is where these differences became, if you like, irrelevant. You know, I think in the sense that even neoliberal inclined people saw the value of state intervention. You know, so perhaps this is suggesting that, you know, if the going gets tough, right, then politics may become secondary, right? Now, I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't take Trump's response or Bolsonaro's response. I wouldn't take that as a neoliberal response. I don't think it was. It was simply a stupid response, right? You know, so people who simply had trouble, understanding the challenge that they were facing, right? So I think it would be an exaggeration to look at that, you know, as a neoliberal response, because I don't think it was. But you know, I don't know. Maybe you know, in all the other countries where you could have had a neoliberal response, everyone was pitching for state intervention, right? Of course, with differences concerning how far you go with certain measures and how long those measures are going to last. Now, the question about necropolitics, this is really a difficult one. And I suggested already in my talk why this is difficult. Maybe I can say this to Louisa. We did a comparative study of responses to floods in Mozambique, Germany, and the US. Because there were floods, major floods in Germany, Frankfurt Oder, border with Poland. And there were also major floods and the cyclone on the Tennessee Valley in the US. And so we compared the responses of people to these floods. And what we found striking was that the American and Mozambican responses were much closer to one another than, for example, the American was to the German. And it was all about life and death. So in Mozambique and in America, there was a much higher threshold for accepting death in a situation like that. So in Germany, I think there was only one death. And that made the floods a big thing, right? Whereas in Mozambique, there were much more. And on the Tennessee Valley, much more, right? But people were not using that as a metric to define the severity of the disaster. And you know, of course, there are other elements I could bring in here. The way that in Germany, you have institutions, you have social security that has actually taken away, if you like, the definitional power from people, right? Such that, you know, people expect protection from the state in a way that people don't in Mozambique and in the United States, right? And so, you know, there you have necropolitics in a very, very radical manner, right? Such that, like I suggested in my talk, in Mozambique, it's not the number of the people who die that matters, but the number of people who survive. So that's necropolitics for you, right? Now, of course, I know the concept is also used in a broader political context, you know, so how, for example, you know, a certain political economy reproduces itself through, for example, committing certain people to death, right? You know, so death as functional to the reproduction of the international system or power relations and so on. So I think there's that element also that one could take into account. But if I wanted to be polemical, I would say that expecting African countries to adopt the same kinds of lockdown measures was necropolitics at its worst. Yeah.
That was an excellent answer. Thank you so much. At least your hand is raised. Is it still raised, or do you have another question? Oh, okay.
I think
Sergio
Sergio.
wants to come back. Go ahead.
Okay. No, this is really a very interesting discussion, and I'm still intrigued by your way to take the sort of let's say cooperation between states and individuals and citizens in coping with disaster, or in this specific case in coping with the pandemic. And my impression is that you, starting from the experience of the most African countries, that you see this in a way which is in opposition. So at least as you presented it, as I understood it. And but I think if you look at certain approaches, also in case of the pandemic, this is more discussed in terms of complementarity, how communitarian solutions could contribute to cope with the pandemic. But of course, at the end, you need also strong states able also to support not only lockdown measures, but also offering a sort of medical infrastructure for the cases in which you have very worst development of the pandemics, or in case you need also, don't know, vaccination. So you need states on this. So therefore, my question would be, if you, I know that is a sort of provocation you are bringing into the discussion, if you say that Sweden is following the African way in dealing with the pandemic, but at the end you have a strong state supporting protected citizens, not a state with assumed a certain omission in protecting the citizens. So therefore, perhaps not really a question, my comment, or asking you for seeing how these different ways, marked communities, families, and states actually work together and not against each other in the case of the pandemic, in your, let's say, imaginary way to find a efficient way to dealing with a disaster.
No, that's a great comment, Sergio. And the reason why I find it great is because I think it takes us beyond the pandemic itself. It takes us into territory that has to do with theory and the methodology of social science. And I'll tell you why. I think the one problem that we face, or that I face as an Africanist, as someone who studies Africa, is that I have to use conceptual vocabulary that has the tendency to represent Africa as a problem, right? So the moment you use sociology to describe Africa, you are not describing a normal situation, you are describing a problem. And so I'm interested in that. And my interest consists not in accepting that you are describing a problem, but in understanding or in finding out, through that, in finding out the limits of our conceptual vocabulary. And I think if I can ascertain those limits, as I see the situation in Africa, I might be able to bring a contribution to sociology in general, right? So that sociology develops its conceptual tools in a much better way to address Brazilian or German or Portuguese problems, because there's always this blind spot, here, because you are used to deploying these concepts here and it all makes sense, right? But the moment you try to do that elsewhere, you're only having a problem all the time, right? So part of what I'm doing here is really is reflecting about the usefulness of our conceptual vocabulary. Where are the limits of this conceptual vocabulary and what can we do with that? And that is why I would resist any suggestion. If anyone were to make that suggestion, I would resist it. The suggestion that I am insisting that Africa is different. It's not different. If anything, what you have in Africa is what you would have anywhere if you were in trouble, right? So that's, that's the basic situation there. So rather than approaching Africa as a problem to be solved, you should approach it as an opportunity that you have to test the scope of your concepts. So that's what I am doing. Now, the responses, of course, one point then I should make now in direct response to your comment is that in Africa then, we approach problems as if we were normal, right? As if we were normal countries, right? So to assume that you are normal is to assume that you have a state with the same capacity as in Brazil or in Germany. To assume, to assume that you are normal is to assume that you have the livelihood conditions that other people have. We don't. So there's always a disjuncture between the way we think about our responses, right, and actual conditions, such that actually whatever we do as a solution is actually a source of problems. Always. It's always a source of problems. Yeah. But I am positive. So I'm saying rather than looking at that as a problem, maybe we can approach that as an opportunity which we have to be a bit more careful in taking our concepts for granted. So I take the point that, Sweden is completely different, right? But that's my point, that, you can use the kind of reasoning that people use in extreme situations, people who are used to dealing with extreme situations, you can use that to much better effect if you have all the institutional infrastructure that you have in Sweden. right? And I mean, this is my view. I know I belong here to a certain group in this whole discussion about how people should have responded to Corona. So my view is that I think the response generally in Europe was more problematic than it was helpful. I think it was, and I've been saying this, and I was so glad. I mean, sad of course, but glad to see that point of view vindicated by the evaluation that was carried out on behalf of the German government. You know, because they basically said not much was actually useful. That's what, you know, that was the message. Not much was really useful in that. And so that is why I was talking in my talk about the dangers of too much knowledge. You know, maybe more pragmatism would have helped. But of course, it's difficult, especially because in situations like this, democracy can be a liability, you know, because you don't want to be seen not to be responding to something, you know. So you know, actionism. You do things because you know you want to be seen doing things, but not because they make sense, right? So I don't think that it would have been easy for European governments not to do much, you know, not, you know, to say, okay, let's relax. It would have been politically suicidal, right? So you have that factor of risk again, you know, an additional factor of risk. Anyway, I take your point about the importance of taking into account the important role that institutions can play. And Sweden is a very good example of that. But underlying that, you know, is the Swedish interest in protecting social infrastructure. And in fact, the first time round, when a lot of people died, you know, and then they realized, you know, that they had failed actually to protect them, people in homes, you know, old people in homes, that they should have thought of that. And, you know, and that's what I've been arguing for, I was arguing for in Africa. Rather than wishing to protect everyone, just concentrate on those that you can protect and whose protection will ensure the protection of others. But not everyone. You don't have the capacity, right? And I think elements of that, you know, so this is like, I think James Scott has written about this stuff, you know, this métis knowledge, you know, practical knowledge. This is what was more required, but you could not have it because you knew too much, right? And because you are democratic societies.
Yeah, perhaps if you allow me just a short comment on democracy, because in many cases, democracy, also in case of Corona, also protected against abuses, and also, so if you look at countries such Nicaragua, in which you have policies exposing people to actually risk, because you didn't have the sort of democratic control of state action. So therefore, I think I know that the role of democratic rules are ambivalent in case of Corona, but in most cases is also a sort of protection of citizens against abuse of authoritarian leaders, as you have also in case of Brazil. So attempts to break with democratic rules, bringing people in non-necessary situations of risk. So therefore, the institutions, democratic institutions, I would say in case of Brazil, for sure, protected citizens, protected people. Yeah.
I mean, you have the extreme case of China now, because, you know, so here's an authoritarian state, right? And the policies which China adopted this zero COVID policy, it's actually killing China economically. But because it's an authoritarian regime, you have no way of correcting it. So I definitely don't want to convey the impression that democracy should be done away with. I'm just saying that in looking at the risk situation, if you want to describe the risk situation, you have to compute democracy as well as part of it. This demand, this need, to act, to do something. You cannot afford not to do something, right? That's part of the risk framework that you have to take into account. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for all of this. I think we're going to be thinking about this for the next 6 months until we have to invite you over again to help us collect our thoughts on this. And I really think that it's great that we end this lecture series more confused than we were in the beginning. I think that's great news. That's my assessment of it. And I just really want to thank Elisio for your thoughts this afternoon. And I'd like to thank Sergio and Mauricio for the opportunity of being here. Thank you for asking me to join you here. It has been fantastic. And so would you guys want to say some last words just for today?
So just thank you also, Mariana, for have followed us in this sort of adventure, which is quite, at least for me, I have learned a lot. And